A reading from the first book of Kings. Elijah said to Ahab, "Go up, eat and drink, for there is the sound of a heavy rain." So Ahab went up to eat and drink, while Elijah climbed to the top of Carmel, crouched down to the earth, and put his head between his knees. "Climb up and look out to sea," he directed his servant, who went up and looked, but reported, "There is nothing." 7 times he said, "Go look out again." And the 7th time the youth reported, "There is a cloud as small as a man's hand rising from the sea." Elijah said, "Go and say to Ahab, harness up and leave the mountain before the rain stops you." In a trice the sky grew dark with clouds and wind, and a heavy rain fell. Ahab mounted his chariot and made for Jezreel. But the hand of the Lord was on Elijah, who girded up his clothing and ran before Ahab as far as the approaches to Jezreel. Verbum Domini. It is right to praise you in Zion, O God. You have visited the land and watered it. Greatly have you enriched it. God's watercourses are filled. You have prepared the grain. It is right to praise you in Zion, O God. Thus have you prepared the land, drenching its furrows, breaking up its clogs, softening it with showers, blessing its yield. It is right to praise you in Zion, O God. You have crowned the year with your bounty, and your paths overflow with a rich harvest. The untilled meadows overflow with it, and rejoicing clothes the hills. It is right to praise you in Zion, O God.
Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia. Alleluia, alleluia. I give you a new commandment. Love one another as I have loved you. Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia.
Dominus vobiscum.
Et cum spiritu tuo.
Lectio Sancti Evangelii secundum Matteum.
Gloria tibi, Domine.
Jesus said to his disciples, I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter into the kingdom of heaven. You have heard that it was said to your ancestors, you shall not kill, and whoever kills will be liable to judgment. But I say to you, whoever is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment, and whoever says to his brother, Rakah, will be answerable to the Sanhedrin, and whoever says, you fool, will be liable to fiery Gehenna. Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar, and there recall that your brother has anything against you, leave your gift there at the altar. Go first and be reconciled with your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Settle with your opponent quickly while on the way to court with him. Otherwise, your opponent will hand you over to the judge, and the judge will hand you over to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Amen, I say to you, you will not be released until you have paid the last penny. Verbum Domini.
Today's section of the Sermon on the Mount begins a long section that has 6 antitheses between what the Old Testament said and what Jesus says. So we'll see this phrase, "You have heard that it was said." That expression, "it was said," is something that is found in a lot of the rabbinic writings. It's a way of saying that God had said this. And the assumption behind that phrase is that God is the authority. Speaking through, especially as we see here, with the ancients, the ancestors, hoi archaioi, that they were the people of Moses in that early time who received this. And two of the very striking elements of what Jesus is saying is, first, he is taking an incredible amount of authority upon himself. It was very distinctive of the rabbinic writings. You can go ahead and read the Mishnah. I think you can find some sections of it online. And when you read the Mishnah or the Talmud, which is a collection of the sayings of the rabbis from the Pharisee party, they will typically say, "You have heard that Rabbi Levi said this, but Rabbi Shimon said this. However, Rabbi Yochanan had this to say on that topic, and Rabbi Ephraim had this to say," and it'll go on and on. And they will quote one rabbi and cite his authority to back up their opinion. And a distinctive element of what Christ is saying is there is no reference to any other rabbi. Jesus is claiming to be the authority. He is the one who can interpret the law on his own power and authority. And that this is one characteristic of his messiahship. And it's something that I've read from various Jewish commentaries on the New Testament that is very difficult for them to accept, that Christ would take that type of authority. And it's a component of the gospel that is also a challenge to us in the modern world, because we are going to be accepting the authority of Jesus Christ as more authoritative than the various claims made in the world, in the culture. And that his claims here are so authoritative that we judge the statements of the world by Christ's teaching, and we do not judge Christ's teaching by the fads of the world. And that's extremely important, because part of the modern mentality is that, A, we are modern. And therefore, as modern people, we necessarily have better ideas than the old people do, than the ancient people. That the wisdom of previous times is to be rejected, and our new ideas are the cutting edge of the evolution of society. That is a core modern attitude. And therefore, Christianity needs to change and adapt its moral teaching to fit the modern attitudes. What we as Christians are going to do is respond to them by saying, no, the authority of Jesus Christ is an eternal authority. Heaven and earth may pass away, but the gospel of Jesus Christ will not. And we have seen over the last 100 and some years various attitudes coming up in the modern world, which also claim to be the cutting edge of evolution. Whether it has been the attitudes of racist nationalism under the Nazis, or whether it be atheistic communism in the Soviet Union, and a wide variety of other groups, and they have gone to oblivion. And the teachings and attempts to change the moral teaching of Jesus Christ in the contemporary period will also go into oblivion. The teaching of Jesus Christ will last. And this is going to be a basic principle for us to deal with, just in the very form of the way Jesus Christ teaches us. Secondly, what is at stake in today's gospel is also very radical. The first verse we read is that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And on the other side, another way that Christ expresses the same issue is that if you call people certain names, you will be liable to fiery Gehenna. That is the word that they were using in the first century as the word for hell. So that what is at stake in Jesus' teaching about righteousness is not whether you are accepted by society or the latest trends and fads, but what is at stake is whether or not you will go to heaven or go to hell. That is the bottom line issue. Now, this is an issue I bring up because it is not something that a lot of modern people want to deal with. It is not a topic that is very popular, but it is what Jesus Christ our Lord will say again and again throughout the Sermon on the Mount. In fact, throughout the sermon, Christ is the one who threatens the danger of hell more often than anybody else in the New Testament. St. Paul never does that. There's no passage in St. Paul where he threatens hell. What he says is you won't go to heaven, draw your own conclusions. Jesus, on the other hand, threatens hell here and in the parables, interestingly enough. And that when we hear these texts, we need to see that the judgment of our soul for all eternity is what is at stake. So, the first principle, as he says here, is seek a righteousness that is greater than that of the scribes and Pharisees. The scribes were the scholars, and they would investigate each law to see the various components of the law and ramifications for that law in daily behavior. So, for instance, a classic example. The law says, you shall not cook a kid goat in its mother's milk. Simple law. The reason, by the way, that I cited an Arab recipe book in my dissertation where I treated that law, because it is a Middle Eastern dish to cook goat meat in goat milk, because goat's milk doesn't curdle when you cook it. So that's why it was used in the recipe. But the Jewish law says to make sure that you never take even the risk of breaking that law. Therefore, you may not serve any meat or milk at the same meal. So your lunch, midday meal might have meat but no dairy, while your breakfast will have dairy but no meat. That would be one of it. But it goes beyond that. Then you also have to make sure you have one set of plates and pots and dishes in which you use that for milk meals, and another set of plates, pots, and dishes for the meat meals, just in case there might be a little bit of meat or a little bit of milk that gets caught in a crack in the pot or the dish. You make sure that they never mix, and this would be the development of the kind of discussion of in rabbinic law. Jesus is asking us to go to another level. And he starts off with the 10 commandments. You shall not kill, as an example. First one he brings up. Now, you shall not kill is one of the 10 commandments. It's quoted in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. And it's a direct quote from there. Mephones in Greek and al tirtzach in Hebrew. Now, a little bit to background. Retzach, the word that's used in Hebrew for thou shalt not kill, is not the same word as killing when you execute a criminal. They use a different word for that. It's a word that means murder, though in Numbers 35 it also means manslaughter. And they will say in the Old Testament that somebody who, the penalty for committing murder, rotzeach, is the death penalty. And when they use the word for the death penalty, they'll use a different Hebrew word. They'll say, for the rotzeach, the murderer, mot yumat, he will die. Use a different word entirely. So it's not just any kind of killing. The kind of killing you do in war is a different word. You typically use harag or mot. But the word for murder, ratzach, is generally what they mean here. So that's the beginning. Now, this is a very basic commandment. Think about what our modern society would be like if just the commandment, thou shalt not murder, were lived out. We have a very high murder rate. People oftentimes ask me, aren't you afraid to go to Israel? And I tell people, I go there to be safe. Because there are fewer murders in Israel than in Birmingham, Alabama, New Orleans, Louisiana, or any other big city that we have throughout the country. So it's safer there. And even though there's tensions and wars and terrorism and all that, that's safer. We live in a place where people have to be afraid of murder. Well, Christ doesn't only want us to obey that law, he wants us to go to the core issue. Notice he doesn't just define, well, murder means if you intended to do it. He doesn't get at that. He says, cut the very basis of committing murder out of your life by not even beginning with an anger that wants to get revenge. You don't even begin with that. As a matter of fact, you don't even call people names like Rakah. Rakah is an Aramaic word. That's why they didn't translate it. Even in the Greek New Testament, they just put the Aramaic word. I'll never forget the first guide that I ever had in Israel was an Armenian Christian. And he said this word, rakah, is still used, but it's very rare. It was a custom that you would go up to somebody that you really were angry with. You would call them rakah and then spit in their face. And that was enough of an action to start a war of revenge between families that would last for generations. And so that's why it's very rare. People don't say that very often, but it is a very serious kind of word. And Christ doesn't even want us to begin a war of words, but rather to negotiate with our enemy. Two things that he says. Come to bring your offering, but only if you reconciled with your enemy first. Secondly, if you are going to court, settle with your enemy on the way so that you don't end up going to prison. That he wants us to have that quality of reconciliation, and that is going to be the righteousness that exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees. And this is just the beginning. We'll have the rest of these antitheses coming up over the next days. But for us to begin with this basic commandment and to see in our very litigious society this kind of attitude undone by what Christ calls the righteousness Christ calls us to, is a first step, and one that we bring to our society so that we can bring a righteousness not only in our own lives, but also pass it on to the people around us.